Perfect. Well, good day. I'm Jeremy Elder, Senior Product Designer on the UX Foundations team. Today I'm going slideless, so I feel a bit exposed. I can't hide behind any slides, but I do have notes, so I will try to stick to those. And as Tori mentioned, I'm going to discuss redesigning merge request widgets. This is work that is in progress, and so I felt it more appropriate to just show kind of my desktop, my landscape of how I'm navigating this and how I'm working through it. So if you're not familiar with this KR, it's about focusing on merge requests, and there's consistently like a negative theme around it in both SUS and NPS related to merge request widgets. And what we're trying to solve here and why it's important is from a UX standpoint, is that merge request widgets they're different from each other. There's many of them. They're often overwhelming with the information they display, and it leads to a lot of confusion. So it's important because if we can streamline the design and the patterns, then it should be ideally make the information more clear, consumable, and actionable. And that's really the goal, is to synchronize, create more of a framework around how these widgets display their information, how they behave, and go from there. So the scope of this from a polished UI and text is to address 9 merge request widgets. You can see them listed in this table. Out of scope would be approvers, branches, merge, and pipelines, because the type of content that is in those are completely, it's different enough that it didn't warrant being part of this effort. And so the scope will be to create a framework that aligns all of these and accounts for all of these, as well as their various states. Some of the constraints that we're working with is just the fact that it's a large number of widgets, and each of them having their own states, their own reporting, their own type of status. There's just a lot there from a scope standpoint. And also the fact that there are these other widgets kind of waiting in the wings to be done, keeping those in mind peripherally as we create a framework just for these. We don't want to have like we do want to have blinders on, but not too much, so that we make a pattern or introduce something that that these won't be able to fall in line with later or work with. Another constraint is just ensuring that the framework is applicable to everything, and you can see there's a lot here. And last constraint that I'll mention is just consideration for other issues that we know exist in the product, but that happen to be surfaced in the context of widgets. So it might not be specific to a widget, but it's something that we could possibly address and help alleviate. A few examples would be using the X, close icon for status and closing and dismissing. So some widgets use that as part of their status, and if we're able to maybe move away from that, maybe we can help solve some of the problems of using the X in multiple ways. Another item kind of related would be pipeline status icons. They're being used for status of other elements. And when we talk about that in the context of merge requests and widgets, that status can start to get confusing when you're trying to look at pipeline, and then there's icons that relate to that, and you're familiar with it, and they're in different places. And then another one from a UI polish standpoint would just be how we use borders and how we group items, how we contextualize information. Those are things that are surfaced by widgets, but not necessarily a product of a widget itself. But if we're able to consider those as a constraint and help work through that, I think we'll also solve for other problems. So like I mentioned, the status is in progress, and I'll just talk a little bit about my process. I'm sorry that I don't have like monster trucks on here or anything that's gonna pop out. I wish I did, because that was awesome. So good stuff, Sherrick. And so my process initially was to review the research that Catherine put together. There's a great deck it's linked to in the agenda, and it walks through all of this. I won't walk through it again. I know she has at some point in the past, but please take a look at that. There's a lot of synthesis in there, a lot of documentation on the purpose of each widget. That's very helpful. So my first kind of foray into this was to go through and review the research, the KRs, the epic. Pedro created a fantastic epic. And so the process here was to contribute to that. I created my own issue to track my my work from a UX Foundation standpoint on the visual design aspect of it. We had a sync kickoff meeting to discuss the scope and address questions. I found that the sync that Ian helped organize was really helpful. Allowed us just to kind of air a few things really quickly and handle it just in a sync fashion with just more of a conversational tone. As part of the process, we have a dedicated Slack channel, MR widgets, which I always read as Mr. Widgets, which is kind of fun too, I guess. And we have plenty of async discussion in there. So join Mr. Widgets if you want to participate there. And I want to call out Ian here because as part of the process, he's done a great job kind of assembling a lot of data and doing an audit of existing widgets, all their states, pulling in the designers who work on those and having everybody contribute. And one of the reasons that we wanted to highlight this in Foundations is because it's not a one-to-many type of work. It's more of a many-to-one-to-many type of work where it affects multiple teams, multiple stages. And then there's also KRs for other teams that are dealing with performance of merge requests and other things around this to help with the SUS and the NPS. So it's a really good example of the team collaborating on a single problem and coming together on it, and then being able to propagate those decisions and have that funnel out or filter out into the rest of the product. So I wanted to highlight that. Let's see here. All right, I'm going to pull up the Figma inventory real quick. All right, so in Figma, I think Ian and Pedro put this together with all the other designers who are contributing, like I mentioned. And what you'll see here is just at a high level, widgets that aren't included, and well, let me just go this mode here, and widgets that are. And so for each of these categories, we have all the states captured. If there's any notes, conversation, updates that are happening, we're capturing these. And then as part of that effort, Ian summarized all of the learnings, excuse me, into, let's see here, this synthesis where basically calling out all the items where they're the same, where they're different. It dealt with headers, iconography, all the text and the structure, iconography, if I didn't say that one already, color, status. So all of these different things is synthesized into action items. And from that, I was able to start my own effort and clarify my, let's see here, my work from a foundation standpoint and have a scope for myself. And so as part of my process, this is how I've kind of categorized all the different items that I need to take into consideration. So what I focused on initially here is, jump back over into Figma, some design exploration. And when I do design exploration, I like to start kind of big and boil everything down and see what's left and distill it and then try to work back out. So very much a divergent, convergent type of a workflow, specifically when it comes to like UI design. And so what I focused initially on was layout and determining structure, responsive behavior, where these widgets live, kind of what's their environment, how are they behaving with other content. I focused on hierarchy and content relationships, iconography, and then big focus on communicating what my ideas behind it and inviting feedback. So let's jump in here just to show that a little bit. So you can see I brought in my list from my issue that lists out the items I'm focused on and started to break out some of these items. Some of them, like I mentioned, they're in progress, so you're not going to see anything there yet. But understanding that we want to have more of a responsive behavior for these, so laying out the structure with frames to address that. We have both fixed and fluid preferences for layout, and these widgets respond to that. So I want to make sure that we're counting for that and how content reflows and how far apart actions can be from their parent and or status, things like that. Wanted to take into account spacing utilities, create a universal action bar that I can pull into some of these items. So really just starting with some initial testing and hierarchy and flow. Took that into some more exploration where looked at indentation specifically. So compact, optimized, or just purely cascading nesting, and putting these things through their paces and seeing, what works best, what's going to flow, what's going to be more readable, getting feedback along the way. And then iconography. So exploring using the smaller status icons and how might we take those and maybe add a highlight to emphasize the parent item while continuing the nested in the sub items, comparing that with current icons. And I haven't really explored this direction quite as much just yet, primarily because I don't like mixing two icon sets. So some of this I'm kind of treeing off and pruning along as I go. You can see there's some exploration here for status. That's another outcome I want to have is shared status for all of the widgets and what that might mean across the board, so that if somebody sees an icon in one, it means similar in the context of another widget. So with this, I found that I had a lot of thinking behind this, and just throwing a barrage of comments on here wasn't really what I wanted to do. I wanted it to feel a little more fluid. So I gave FigJam a little trial and started just sketching some notes on top where it pulls, the design straight from my working file. But then I'm able to kind of call out a few things and, pose some questions, get some additional feedback, and work through it in that fashion. So a lot there. Next steps would be to align on the framework recommendations. So what I plan on doing is continuing exploration here, and with the sad departure of Ian, you're going to be missed on this project. We're going to be trying to assimilate some of these ideas and present them to the designers that we can get some feedback with, hopefully next week at the soonest, and start to assimilate these and get some more conversation through Figma on that, verify an idea or concept of a framework with those different teams, hoping to do some validation testing before the end of the milestone. And then another item I wanted to call out, and you won't see it presented here, but part of handoff, how we get this work to other teams, because the challenge next becomes, how do we do this in a way that's synchronized, that we don't roll out one widget change and everything becomes extra kludgy in the meantime, where we have one that's updated and three that aren't, and another that's updated. And so we've been discussing how we might do this. And part of that is handoff, for one. And so what I want to be really intentional about is how I hand off these artifacts for development. And one of the items that I want to consider is accessibility. And so I've created this resource, Accessibility Blue Lines. And as part of this effort, once we land on a framework, what I plan on doing is going through and annotating for accessibility. So I want to show the content relationships, both from an individual widget, but also as a set. So if we say, okay, a group of widgets is an unordered list, and each one's a list item, and there's these items that are interactive and these that aren't, what would we call it from a region standpoint, or semantically? How do we identify each list item? How do we identify the actions? What is the focus order, the keyboard order? Is there any hidden content that would get announced for screen readers, but that is not displayed on screen, potentially about the status or other elements? So I want to make a really clear and concerted effort to do that, so that all teams have the same kind of mindset behind how we implement these, because it will be different teams that go ahead and code these up and update them. And another idea that someone mentioned, apologies for not remembering who specifically, was to roll out these updates behind a feature flag so that we can do one at a time, but behind a feature flag, so that when we release it, all the updates come in at the same time. And that'll effectively allow us to see the changes in line and work through that. Let's see here. Another next step would be to create epics and issues for those teams to work on that. I also plan on, with the framework and the work in Figma, creating a Figma assets that are pretty robust, where you might be able to configure a widget very quickly, whether it's new or for state, so that any designer can either create a new type of widget or represent their current widget in any state, any kind of layout, and any screen moving forward. So hopefully we'll have those assets in there as well. That'll be really robust. And then Pajamas documentation around just merge request framework and widgets. So a lot there. I definitely want to thank Pedro and Ian for helping structure the effort and continue to move it forward. And thanks to everyone who has put together the pieces that are part of the audit and that we've been able to leverage to make these decisions. And for those who will be weighing in, I appreciate your time towards that too. So I think that being said, we can pass it over to questions if there are any.
Yeah, I echo your last thanks. And also I wanted to shout out to Amy for her leadership in the UX writing front, which will be a very important part of this work, because text is what users apprehend more than anything else. And also from the accessibility front, it will be very important. Yeah, so I don't have any specific questions. Let's see what other questions people have, but thank you so much also to you, Jeremy, for the presentation and the work you've done, Ian, and all the designers that contributed to the audit. Tori, you have a question.
Yeah, you touched on this at the end a little bit, but my question was whether there's been thought about creating like a widget region in Pajamas, so then we have this built out in GitLab UI and different stage groups can, you know, easily adopt it for their particular areas.
Yeah, I think that's TBD, but that would be my plan. I know we've had some discussion on regions and layouts and different, and then objects. So we have a few things working in Pajamas that are, I think, that we're going to have to clarify. So where this lives, I think, is to be determined. But yes, that concept, I think, is what we'll move towards having exist. And I second Pedro's thanks to Amy, because she was also a voice strong for some of the accessibility and the thinking that we're going to be doing in there. So
Awesome. Over to Becca.
Yeah, hey, this is such a huge initiative. Thank you for tackling it. There's a lot of parallel efforts going on, at least I know within Secure and Protect. I've been collaborating with Pedro, and then of course as part of that Figma, I've been adding in a lot of screenshots. There's a lot of ongoing efforts as well. So I will, you know, continue to update those as things progress. But one thing I did want to call out, which I mentioned in the agenda there, is that we have seen in some user testing, users that are newer to CI/CD or application security, they will sometimes misconstrue a green check mark with the secure jobs running successfully. They'll sometimes interpret that as all is good here, no security findings were found, no vulnerabilities were found. And so that's something that we've tried to tackle. I know Camelia has done a lot of work with exploring different iconography to try to communicate, like, yes, hooray, good, like, job passed, which means that, you know, that in and of itself is a success, because you can configure scanners in a lot of different ways. And sometimes if they're configured in a way that causes the job to fail, that, you know, that's obviously something we need to communicate. Like, it needs to be configured properly and play well with CI/CD. But how do we show, yes, you know, it ran successfully, and yet there were vulnerabilities detected? That's something that I think keeps popping up here and there. So I know I just wrapped up the SaaS to Complete CMS, and application security analysts, engineers who are familiar with CI/CD and familiar with AppSec, they understand these concepts. But there was somebody new on a team, and she's a developer who just got out of the boot camp. And so I asked her, you know, are there any security vulnerabilities in this MR? And she said, nope, green check mark, looks good. And it's like, oh yeah, that's not what that means. So I don't know if that's something that should be addressed at this higher MR level. I don't know if this is something particular to secure and protect, but it's something that keeps popping up that we're continuing to look at. So just thought I'd mention it.
No, I think that's helpful, and that's one of the next steps. Just going back to this, and that I've put the ask out for, is to help identify what the statuses are and how they bubble up. So is this at the parent level? Does this mean that this is the highest warning or alert of anything within, or can we have, you know, severe things, but it's only a warning because it doesn't stop the pipeline? And what's the relationship to the pipeline? So as part of the framework, I want to help create general rules that would hopefully address something like that, as far as when does something trigger a failure or a block in the merge request, versus when is something a warning that can be continued, versus when is something successful but there's still things that are failures within. And so I think that's part of this, and hoping to get some more feedback on that and work through that. I'm going to try with the rest of this week and early next to kind of assimilate what I have in my mind, and then we'll put that out for some feedback and reaction that we can work through. And it might be nuanced where, you know, some widgets, they're never going to trigger a failure, and they're never going to see this blocking status of the MR, but they're still going to experience other failures within. And so how do we adjust those rules and have kind of a decision tree of that? So I appreciate you calling that out, and that's something that I'll be sure to involve you in hopefully next week.
Actually, I just realized that this is something that I haven't put into the Figma yet, but security approvals and vulnerability checks. I mean, there's a lot of different configurations that somebody can set up. So you can configure your project so that if a particular type of job fails, then the pipeline fails. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you can allow for failure, right? So that's something else that needs to be communicated in addition to certain policies. And I know that the Protect team is working on more policy management stuff that will be released soon. And so right now that we have, you know, security approvals, so that if a security vulnerability of critical high or unknown status is detected, you can enable it to block the MR from being merged until a approver comes along and says, you know, it's okay to merge. So I'll just go into the Figma and make sure that that is also captured, that approval section.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's helpful. And yeah, and part of this effort, not to dumb it down, for lack of a better term, but will be to just to say, hey, we're just going to use these are our statuses, and this is what it looks like, and really place some extra emphasis or weight on the content that that I know Amy's working on, so that we can make sure that the language around it is clear, and hopefully communicate those types of scenarios, because yeah, it gets complex pretty quick. So thanks for doing that and adding it.
Yeah, one little bit of context that I wanted to add as well is in the periphery of the work that Jeremy, Ian, and Amy are doing here is the also understanding what is beyond this work. So right now we're doing this mostly polishing of the current experience, not only visually, but also in terms of writing, so that it's as low effort as possible with the biggest gain possible. But at the same time, we have research that Catherine did, and Jeremy showed a little bit of that initial synthesis, and she also did some interviews about how engineers use the widgets and which points and how valuable they are. And in turn, that will allow us to redesign the widgets in a more innovative way with more data to back it up. And at the same time, we're tracking more and more the actual interactions that people have with the widgets themselves, because unfortunately, we don't have today a lot of quantitative data for that. And it would have been very helpful to have it before Jeremy started working on this, but nonetheless, we're starting to track it now so we can make better decisions. But it was interesting. So what I want to get at is that we have this work that will be for the mid-long-term vision of merge request widgets. And Jeremy's doing all of this. And I was talking with Ian about it, and he actually asked me, so why are we doing this now and investing this effort in doing this polishing, where maybe we end up knowing through research that we actually need to redesign all of the widgets or put them all behind a tab or put them in another location in a sidebar, or I don't know. And I think that's a very good question, because it's just about the effort that it takes us to create value and the time that we rob users from that value, right? So we could say we're not going to do any of this, but we would spend months researching and redesigning all of the widgets to then release them and have a big impact. But what we've decided to do is we acknowledge that there are things we can do now that are small and that will have a big impact. So let's not rob users of that value while we work on the other things. And maybe it will invalidate all of Jeremy's work. I don't think it will, nor the work that Amy's doing. I think we will learn a lot from this to apply in the future. But nonetheless, I think that's a really important lesson about iteration and and not robbing users from value in that iteration process. So yeah, I just wanted to share that context about why we're doing this way.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And to that point, yeah, it would be awesome to have so much more like input now before we do this. And how I view like system thinking and approaching this is that right now there is no system. And once we get all of the widgets on the bus tracking down the highway in the same direction, we can then say, well, we need to divert and we need to go off this ramp or go off this, but everything is there together doing it the same now. So we can have everything pivot together and continue to move forward in a synchronized way, rather than everybody's in their own lane doing things, trying to get to the same destination and trying to navigate. Once we're able to have a system approach to this, we'll be able to be a lot more flexible and iterative in the future. So to that point, yeah, if anything I do here is completely wrong, it's going to be a lot easier to fix it in the future because everything's going to be shared in that way. And likewise, once other widgets come on board that bus, we'll be able to say, well, we actually need to rearrange a few things or do some other things and adjust. So it'll be very iterative, but I think getting everything synchronized initially will help, even if it is just at a UI polish level. So.
Yeah, and one last thing, I don't want to hijack this a lot, but one last thing I just wanted to mention is also thank you to Tori for creating space for Jeremy to work on this. And I hope that, well, you don't have a lot of people in the UX Foundations team, but I hope that over time, either with the people that we have today or with more people, that we can invest in more of these initiatives where we ask for help from the UX Foundations team and from people that are outside of the usual stage group work and can lend their expertise into these very important areas. So yeah, thank you for that, and that's fingers crossed for the future.
Becca, do you want to vocalize your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if we're planning on doing any solution validation from any of the work that will come out of this, whether it's a complete, re-architecting or, iconography. Is that going to be part of this initiative?
I hope so. I don't know if Ian or Pedro, you'd probably be better suited to jump in relation to the entire epic if you're able to.
I think Pedro just jumped, so.
Okay. That's my hope as the next step would be able to validate this as leanly as possible to keep it moving, but yeah, I won't ramble on that, but yes, short answer, yes, I hope so.
Any other questions or comments for Jeremy? Awesome. Well, now we all have Mr. Widgets in our vocabulary. And thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing your process.